There we go. So today I'm joined by a fellow Brit. So let's say hello to the one and only Mr. Nick Aldis. Hello, how are you?
Hello, Lewis. Thanks for having me.
Well, first of all, it's a bit of a strange time for us all at the moment because here in the UK we're in lockdown, and I believe you're in a kind of a lockdown as such, but not as harsh as kind of what we've got here in the UK. So, what are you doing to keep busy at the moment during all this pandemic?
I, I have to say, knock on wood, I'm actually staying very productive. For some reason, this sort of reduced reduced activity outside of your own home is kind of, I think, in some ways it's kind of like when people talk about losing a sense and then other senses being heightened. It's kind of increased my at-home productivity, which is something that I have to sort of work on anyway, because if I'm not on the road wrestling, I'm at home trying to be productive. I don't have an office or, any other sort of place of work as far as non-wrestling stuff goes. So any other ancillary stuff I'm doing, I have to do it from home. So I'm writing, or if I'm, if like right now we're creating a lot of content for the NWA YouTube page and stuff like that. Very similar to this, just doing what we can with the resources available. But fortunately, I've got a fairly decent home gym setup. I mean, obviously, it's not a commercial gym, level of stuff, but I've got everything you really need to get it done. So I've got Olympic bar, I've got an Airdyne bike, I've got dumbbells, I've got a bench, I've got free weights. So it's kind of like it's been fun because I've been doing a lot of sort of old school iron, Arnold barbell workouts and stuff, and I've been, it's so far so good. I'm not really that stir crazy because, like I said, I'm if I'm not on the road, I'm used to sort of making the most of my time at home as it is. So between that and having a 5-year-old and trying to sort of dedicate a chunk of time each day to certain projects, I'm actually, lasting this out pretty well. Certainly better than what I'm seeing from a lot of my compatriots on, looking based on their tweets and stuff. I mean, some of them are ready to crack.
Well, I've got to say, it's great actually to finally get the chance to interview you because obviously, being in Britain, you're someone that's flown the flag for everyone in wrestling in the UK. So I wanted to go back to the very beginning. What was it for you growing up as a child in the UK that made you fall in love with wrestling? Can you remember something specifically that just made you fall in love with the industry as such?
Yeah, I'm going to guess that we're around the same age. As a '90s kid, it's like I don't really remember watching wrestling as a young kid, but I remember knowing all of the names and knowing who they were and being a huge fan of Bret the Hitman Hart and British Bulldog in particular. But I was also like Undertaker and Hulk Hogan, Ultimate Warrior. Jake the Snake I was a huge fan of Jake, but I couldn't tell you any specific memories of watching wrestling during that period. Besides, SummerSlam at Wembley Stadium and stuff, which sort of everyone paid attention to. But I've talked about this in other interviews, but it really shows the power of the WWF marketing machine back then, in that you didn't even have to watch wrestling to be familiar with all the characters and know their names and their, what they look like. And I had all the toys, I had the annuals, I had so the memories really go back as far as I can recall. But as far as like really paying attention and watching was probably mid '90s. So like sort of the Bret Hart era. And then it was a little bit of a, as anyone who tracks the business will tell you, the mid '90s there was a little bit of a dip in business there, and then obviously by the end of the '90s there was this huge boom, and it was such a big part of pop culture. And I remember within the space of like 2 years, I was there was some of my friends at school would sort of make fun of me for being a wrestling fan, to within a couple of years, everyone was a wrestling fan, and it was cool now. And I got, and all the kids would come to school in their DX shirts and, and this kind of stuff. So it's definitely always been there. But I would say when I really started paying attention to it on a deeper level, as far as not just like, oh, this is cool, to really looking at it and thinking, I think I want to do this. I think I want to be a pro wrestler one day, was probably around 99. The WrestleMania 15 with The Rock and Stone Cold was kind of like, after that was my period. That was a sort of penny drop moment where I went, I think I want to be like the bad guy. Because The Rock was the bad guy at that point, which is funny for people to think of now. And I'm sure any younger viewers of this would be kind of curious to see how that, to think, how could anyone dislike The Rock, but he was the top heel at that point. And I remember having this sort of, a little bit of an internal dialogue in myself where I went, I like him better than the good guy. Like, I want to be like him, and it's funny because throughout my career, I've always preferred and leaned towards being a heel, being a villain. So it's kind of, and a lot of that dates back to seeing Rock and, and things of that nature, because it was something about the ability to control the audience with just a look, or just with some body language. And because the heel, and then, I don't have to get too into the weeds here on the sort of, the finer points and nuances of wrestling, but the heel really dictates the story. The heel kind of controls the action, and so the heel has to have that sort of keen sense of what the audience likes and dislikes. And I've always been sort of comfortable with people not liking me if that's how they feel. I'm not one of those people that's desperate to be popular with everyone and for everyone to love me. I'm very comfortable with, hey, whatever you feel is up to you. And I've had that self-awareness always. And I think that's what lends itself well to being a good heel in wrestling.
And I wanted to go in regards to training in the UK. I mean, you all know the UK now it's got a massive wrestling scene. You've got so many promotions, so many training opportunities. But was it the same for you going back to when you first started training, or has it definitely grown over the years, in your opinion?
Oh, it's absolutely grown. There's no question of that. But at the same time, it's funny because I grew up in Norfolk. I grew up in Docking, a little village, just about 15 miles from King's Lynn, which is where I was born. And my entire sort of teenage years, especially, I would just, I would grumble and moan about how, there's nothing to do here. There's no opportunities. Like, all the cool stuff happens in London or in Manchester or in, or wherever. And it's just, it's rubbish being in Norfolk. There's nothing cool, like, there's all the cool stuff goes somewhere else. And when I first started kind of just nibbling around the edges of looking to try and get into the wrestling business, sure enough, most of the stuff that came up was Kent, London, here, and I was, here we go again, not that would have stopped me, and later on didn't, but it just so happened that the Knight family, who now are sort of much more well known as far on a sort of mainstream level because of Paige and obviously because of the movie and everything, they were in Norwich. And I remember I was in sixth form, and one of my mates, Jimmy, came in one day and went, "You're never going to believe this. I found a wrestling school. It's in Norwich." And I went, "You're kidding," like. And so me and Jimmy and my friend Chris, we went. Back then, that whole the whole family, it really is a family business for them. So they would have the holiday camps. And so in the summer, if you were able, that was what that was the bread and butter for wrestlers all through I think as far back as the 80s, but definitely through the 90s and into the early 2000s, bread and butter was the holiday camps. If you could get, because pretty much all the holiday camps in the country would have some sort of wrestling show at least once a week, and some of the bigger maybe twice. And most of the meat of the contracts would be given, like Brian Dixon and All Star Wrestling. They had Butlins, and that was the big fish. And then the Haven camps were sort of split up between sort of 4 or 5 different guys, but it was all controlled by sort of 1 or 2 sort of power brokers who would then divvy them up and give them to different teams, they would call them. So it was basically just, usually, depending on the size of the camp, it would be like 4 wrestlers and a referee and a ring, and you would do 2 singles matches, and then usually at some point during the second match, the bad guy from the first match would come out and interfere, and then the good guy from the first match would come and then they would set up a tag match, have a little interval, and then do a tag match. So it'd be a 1-hour show, right? But the nights they had a handful of Pontins camps, and then whatever else they had going on. I think at that point they had shows in Great Yarmouth and some of the other sort of seaside towns and stuff. So in this, they didn't have a regular training schedule. They just would do camps where it was just intensive sort of training over the course of 2 or 3 days. So we went to one of those in the summer of, I want to say 2003, and it was like 30 degrees. It was blazing hot. They had us do all this crazy, run drills with each other on like piggybacks, and then like all these sort of calisthenics and squats and bumps and this and that. And I remember puking and all that sort of stuff. But the thing is I'd seen enough and read enough at this point as far as how people were broke into the business to sort of expect it. So I was okay with it. But so it turned out, luckily, so in that respect, Norfolk was actually not a bad place to be because of the locality of those guys. And then I started with them, and so I had been lifting weights probably since I was 12 or 13. So by the time I started with them, I was 17, and I had a half decent physique, and so that sort of was for those old school guys especially. That was enough for them to be like, all right, we'll put him on a show, just because that was the sort of mentality. Was like, if you had a halfway decent look, that was your foot in the door. And I could never understand why other guys wouldn't do that. Because I would look and think, well, everyone on TV has a good physique. Why, that's what I want to be. So that seems like a no brainer, but it's amazing how many people didn't bother, so it was sort of like, I was able to progress quite quickly just because I bothered to work out, and did a few shows for them. And like I said, because they were so busy actually just running shows all the time, wasn't really able to be trained as frequently as I needed to sort of, because I wanted to do this and nothing else. I mean, that was, once I was in, I wanted to be all in. So we found another school down in Purfleet, just outside London, where they would run. They were just a school. That's all. It was called Dropkicks Academy, and that's where Marty Skirl went. That's where we met Marty. I used to give him a lift every week because he was only 15 or something when we were started, so he couldn't even drive. And then Stu Bennett, who some people will know better as Wade Barrett, he was there. And a lot of the guys who went on to sort of become stalwarts of the sort of British scene, like Shah Samuels and stuff, were there too. So it was just a different sort of, you could tell that the level was higher there, as far as because it was a bigger catchment area. So there were all these young, hungry, talented kids all trying to sort of make it and chase it. So it was, between those two things, I was full time within a year and a half of sort of training. I was at old school again. It sounds like ancient describing this to like a teenager now or something, but I remember somebody saying to me, and I can't remember who, but it might have even been Ricky Knight. Probably was. They said, you should call Dixon. He'd like you. You've got the right look. That you'd get Dixon would book you. And he did. Brian was his notoriously anti-technology. Even as we got well into the age of email and sort of the fledgling days of social media with MySpace and stuff, he checked his emails once a week. So it was like so there was no point emailing him because he wouldn't even know how to open an attachment or anything. So it's not like you could send him, tape or send him a video or a picture or anything. You had to just physically call him on the phone. And I remember someone gave me his number and I called him and he answered. And I said, I introduced myself and said I was looking for work and stuff. And all he said was, "How big are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm 6'4", and I was at the time like 16 stone or something. And he's like, "Do you look good?" And I was like, I think I look pretty good. He's like, "Okay, well, come to Skegness on Tuesday." Skegness was a couple hours drive from Norfolk, so I went to Skegness on that Tuesday. He put me on the show in some, I don't know, it's probably just a tag match or something easy. Lars seemed to do okay, and he looked at me and went, "Oh, you look good. You can start full time." And I was just like, "Well, what does that mean?" And he's like, "Well, you start on a Tuesday, and then it goes Skegness to Bognor to Bognor Regis to Minehead, then back to Bognor, then back to Minehead, then back to Skegness, and then Mondays are off." So I went, "Okay." And he was just like, "Okay, so start next week." And I was just like,
Wow.
"Okay." And that was that. So for like the next sort of year or so, that was pretty much what I did, or at least for the full-time season, which I think at that point was like March to sort of October. So it was, I mean, yeah, I remember explaining that to Americans when I came to America to get more training and to try to get noticed and stuff. And they went, "Wait, you wrestle 6 days a week?" Like, "Oh my God, like that's amazing," because there was nowhere else in the world where you could do that anymore. Back in the day, here in the States with all the old territories and stuff, that was the norm. Every local territory had this sort of weekly circuit where they would all run these shows or whatever. And so it was just funny to me because I would always get these grizzly old timers kind of going, "Well, back in my day, we wrestled every day, we'd wrestle here and then we'd get in the car and we'd go wrestle here and blah, blah, blah." And I'd be like, "Yeah, I did that too." And I put the ring up and took the ring down every day, and I had to ride in the back with all the merchandise and the foam fingers and everything else. So yeah, I get it.
I mean, that's what's for me. I mean, at the moment, I actually take on a GM role at a local promotion here called Evolution Wrestling. And as a kid, I always loved wrestling, and I didn't know how the industry worked. So throughout the time I've been there, I was surprised, like you just mentioned then, like most wrestlers would get into a car and you would have 5-6 people squashed in. They come in hours before to set the ring up. They take the ring down, and it just gave me an idea on how hard people work. It's not a well.
It's the circus. You basically until you get to a point where someone's going to pay you a salary to do this, and that usually requires there to be some sort of television deal. You're basically in the circus. You have to wear a bunch of different hats, and you have to sort of because the margins are so small for for all the wrestlers, they know that their goal is obvious. I remember thinking that I wanted to make money, and I wanted to when I was working on the British independent scene, there was never really a part of me that thought I'll be able to make a living from this, this particular. I saw it as a step, to being able to make a career of it. And obviously since that time, thanks to some of the more entrepreneurial guys, that has changed somewhat. And there are guys who can between merchandise and content platforms and various different things can sort of set up some pretty decent revenue streams and make a full-time living as an independent wrestler in Britain. But outside of, I remember seeing guys like Johnny Storm, and Johnny would just be all about selling merchandise, and a lot of those guys wouldn't work for Dixon because Dixon wouldn't allow anyone else to sell merchandise because that's where he made all his money. He would sell. He would get wholesale WWE merchandise. And I don't know whether he did that just through regular sort of like a retail channel, or whether it was because he had some contacts at WWE through like Regal and stuff. I never really got to the bottom of that. But at every show he did, he would sell. He had all the proper WWE action figures and T-shirts and stuff like that. So that's all he cared about, because the show was just really a backdrop for him to basically for his retail business. But for the talent, guys like Johnny and stuff could make they would make more money almost from their merchandise and stuff. So they wouldn't really work for Dixon that much, or if they did, it was just because they didn't have anything else on their calendar that day. And I remember, toward like I did a couple of shows for Brian even after I started with TNA. I remember I came back and me and Doug did some for Brian as a favor. We did some as a British Invasion, and I remember, you know, saying, okay, we want to get paid X amount, and believe me, it was way lower than we would have charged anyone else. And Brian was still acting like we were asking him for a kidney, you know, like he's like, how much, you know? And there's like, oh, and I want to sell merchandise too. He's like, oh, you're raking me over the coals there, you know, like, but he, you know, but that's just, but you had to be that way to make a living from it, you know, on every level. And there was the sort of quid pro quo between full-time promoters like Brian and the wrestlers, where he knew, look, you need the reps, you know, you need to be on shows all the time to be getting good and to be learning your craft and to be getting exposure. And I need you to work at a certain price so that my margins stay where they are so I can make a living, you know. And that's the eternal struggle between promoters and wrestlers, you know, particularly at that level.
Now, I mean, for me, just when I've done, you know, over the years, when I've looked at certain interviews you've done, and I've done research, you've always seemed, you see some wrestlers and they have a very one-minded kind of aspect of wrestling, but you've always really kind of understood the business. You've always been very business focused as well, and it seems like you've always tried to, wherever you go, you've always tried to do the best for the business that you work for. Like you're very switched on to wrestling, if that would make sense. So would you say you've always had a passion for the business of wrestling, as opposed to just go into to have the glory and you know, do the matches?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I fell in love with the behind the scenes aspects of the business, or almost as quickly as I did the idea of being a wrestler and being, you know, being the guy in front of the curtain or in front of the camera. It's you know, that's just, I guess that's just passion. But I also figured out fairly quickly that no one's just going to give you money in this business. That you know, if they think, but by the way, that's not exclusive to wrestling, but wrestling is perhaps a more harsh example of the mentality. But you know, ultimately, if they find someone with talent and they think that he'll accept X amount, they're not going, even though typically someone in that position would make Y, they're not going to just give that to that guy until you ask for it. You know, I mean, that dates back to the very beginning. I mean, I remember the first match I had. I did a battle royal as part of the trainees for Ricky Knight in Norwich, and I didn't get paid for that. Didn't expect to. But then he ran a show in Hunstanton, which is where I went to high school, and they put us in a 6-man tag, and it was, I mean, half the people there had come from school. They'd come to see us, right? And I remember thinking, I should probably get paid for this, you know. And we did the show, put the ring up, took the ring down, and when we were taking the ring down, I remember walking up to Paddy and saying, "Hey, do we get paid for this?" And he just sort of muttered something and kind of walked off, and I just stood there, okay. And then like 2 minutes later, Julia, his wife, came steaming at me, just like, you know, yelling at me like, how disrespectful, you're a trainee and you're an apprentice and like blah, 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 and this and that. I just remember thinking, oh God, like I'm never going to work for them again. I'm going to be kicked out of the business. I'm going to, be blackballed forever and all this kind of thing. I remember my friends looking at me like, what did you do? And I was just like, well, 2 minutes later, Paddy came around the corner and he stuffed a tenner in my hand. And he said, there, you get that because you had the balls to ask for it. And it was a very valuable lesson that I sort of took with me, because I've had exchanges like that on every level in the business, where I've said, I'm pretty sure I'm worth this. You disrespectful punk, like, oh, how dare you think that, blah, 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 blah. Then, a couple of days like, okay, here you go. It's just the way it's just the way that it works, because they want to see if you really get it, and what you described in terms of your observation of me is a blessing and a curse. I can tell you that for nothing, because it's probably why I don't work for WWE at this point, because I've encountered too many guys who just are not getting anywhere near what they should be getting, because they're too busy just being like, oh, I'm just happy to be here. I'm just so grateful for the opportunity. Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you're on a television show where they're getting a giant rights fee, you know, millions of dollars every week, and they're paying you 65 grand. Like, you're not, you know, it's, and I would encounter this in TNA. There were certain guys who came in who thought they were doing the right thing by being like the little angel, like, oh yes, oh thank you, I'm just so happy to be here. I'd do this for free. No, don't say that. Like, you never do this for free, you know? And unfortunately, I mean, I can't tell you the number of times, like, certain people who worked backstage at TNA, who now work at WWE, by the way, which is probably why I don't work there, would say to me, why can't you be more like so and so? He's got a great attitude. He's such a team player, blah blah. And I remember saying to him one day, I said, well, what you mean is he takes the first offer, like, which is a slap in the face offer, and he just takes it because he just wants to be on TV, you know, or because he wants to post on social media that he's got signed. And you know, it's an eternal struggle that will forever rage on in this business. But it's one of the reasons why I love working for the NWA now and for Billy, because Billy, he's an artist first, and he's been on the other side of that with record companies and stuff his whole life, where he's sitting there going, you wouldn't be talking to me if you didn't want my stuff, so let's make a deal, you know. And Billy, he 100% controls every facet of his business with the Smashing Pumpkins. You know, the publishing, the touring, the whole thing. Like, he knows exactly how much I went to a few of their when they toured. They did the big arena tour in 2018. I went to Madison Square Garden with him, and I went to Atlanta with him, and he would tell, he could tell you exactly how much they took on merchandise that night, you know, exactly what the advance was and all this kind of stuff. Like, because he just pays attention, and you have to pay attention, because like I said, no one's going to give you money. You have to negotiate everything as an independent contractor.
I mean, you were saying just then about, you know, you wouldn't always accept the first offer. Now, a lot of people in that situation would be like, you know, you just said that they would accept anything because they were just grateful they were getting TV time and they were in a big promotion. So where does that come from inside you? Because that's something I respect, and I think that is the best way to be, staying true to yourself and knowing your own worth. So where do you think that comes from, that inner strength to be able to say, no, I'm worth more, and to actually stand up for yourself? And you know, if people think that's opinionated, then so be it. Where does that come from in you?
Well, you know, I'm sure some of it comes from my parents, particularly from my mother. You know, she doesn't. Yeah. She has always been very. She's one of those people that's like, takes everything with a pinch of salt. You know, not cynical necessarily, not negative, not seeing the worst and stuff, but no, not always, you know, but always making sure to verify, you know, and my father was, you know, he was one of the most, like, my father was, he played rugby professionally, before I came along. I mean, he was 50 when I was born, so obviously it was, you know, long before I came along. And he worked he was a plant breeding scientist. So he worked mostly for pharmaceutical companies, but he worked in the plant breeding sort of agriculture, but in the sort of commercial agriculture field. And he was so well respected by his peers, you know, and he was, my whole childhood, I remember going with him to his offices and stuff, and he was the boss. Like, he was in that particular area, he was the sort of the buck stop with him. So he had the big corner office and all that kind of thing. And I remember it didn't really occur to me until much later on that, like, everyone here really likes him, you know, that he's one of the guys. Like, he would walk down to the cafeteria and hang out with all the guys who were about to go out in the tractors and the combines and go out into the fields and stuff. Yeah, what's going on, boys? You know, like, they weren't like, oh, the boss is coming.
Yeah.
You know, they didn't have that. Like, there was a real, they you know, and it was only much later on that I really understood that they really respect him. And I guess some of that just sort of carried over. But for me, it was, when I have a passion for something, I learn stuff without even trying, you know, and that's like, I'm taking some online courses now. Like, I'm trying to, you know, I'm doing a course in app development and trying to sort of get my head around coding and stuff. And you know, it's just not the way my brain is wired. Like, I'm trying really hard to get it and to, you know, to broaden my horizons. But I just remember as a kid, once I really made the point, once I really sort of understood, like, I'm pretty sure this is what I want to do with my life. I wasn't even trying to learn stuff, but I just was. You know, I was reading everything. I would, you know, watch documentaries, watch all this different stuff, and it just stuck the first time. You know, and along the way, I really started, like, you know, again, wasn't something that I made a conscious decision to do, but I think just, if you want to succeed in industry, any industry, more than likely the first thing you're going to do, or at least you should, if you're being logical, is you would study the people that have been successful in that industry. So I went back and studied, okay, well, how did Vince McMahon build this empire, you know, and what came before that, and how did WCW become what it is, and where did that come from, and how did Hulk Hogan become this giant star, and where did that come from, and how did that, you know, happen, and Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock, and, you know, Ric Flair and Bret Hart, like, how did that happen, you know, what, like, and going back through, and then it was, by the time I got to TNA, I was, you know, I got signed when I was 21. I'd come off the back of Gladiators. And I just remember really thinking, I want to try and get around Kevin Nash and Sting and Scott Steiner and Mick Foley. I wanted to try and get around the top guys so that I could learn from them, you know, and sort of, you know, because I knew that if I could just get you know, any sort of osmosis, you know, from them, that would set me up. And Kevin ended up being the really the one who I learned the most from in that respect. And, you know, because he would just, you know, he's just so he's so like that. I mean, he's all about business and all about just like, hey, you got to piss a few people off here and there to, you know, but you got to take care of his number one. And I remember one day he just sort of turned to me, and he was talking about something, and I'd got enough of a relationship with him at that point to be able to sort of throw in my 2 cents. And I'd said something, I can't remember what it was, but I just remember him turning to me and being like, you really get it, you know, like, you know, and then after that, he would speak up for me. He would go to Dixie, go to Vince or Terry Taylor, whoever, and be like, I've been around long enough to know when someone gets it, this kid gets it. Like, wow, you know, you give it, you know, just keep. And Jeff Jarrett noticed it too, and that's why whenever Jeff was in a position of power, he would always be like, he's my guy, you know, like, come, you know, give him a shot, give him the ball. And that's, you know, that's really what it comes down to. But you also have to learn from your mistakes too. And I've done plenty of those. So it's like, you know, hills to die on, where I've looked back now and gone, oh, I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I acted that way. Like, what an idiot. Like, I've burnt a bridge now with that person and this person. And it's just like, that's the business we're in. You know, it's still rooted in that secretive nature, that sort of carny nature of like, you'll only know when you have to know kind of thing. And that's the culture.
I mean, you just said when you joined TNA, you were 21. Now, for someone of that age, I mean, if I went back to me being 21 and getting that kind of opportunity, when at the time you were there, you were surrounded by every legend and pioneer at the time in wrestling. Was there ever a moment where you kind of looked around and thought, oh, I used to watch, all of these and were in awe of them?
All the time.
Yeah.
Like I was horrible. I mean, I was terrible the first 6 months. I mean, I just was awful. I mean, I was green anyway, really green. But add to that the fact that I had never really worked any sort of television style. I've come exclusively from the holiday camp style, which is like, yay, come on, kids, like, just working the crowd the entire time, not having to think about cameras or time or anything like that. And in fact, the opposite, because with TV, it's like you have to stay to your time. You cannot go over. Whereas with Dixon, he would get upset with you if you went under, like, like because he's sitting there going, oh, you're stealing money, like you only did 12 minutes and you should have done 14, whatever. So it's like, it was like, so there's just, it's like learning a new language, right? And so I'm trying to get that. At the same time, I'm also coming off of a year from not wrestling, because when I did Gladiators, they wouldn't let me wrestle. Because they didn't want me to get hurt. So in between Gladiators filming seasons, I might have done a couple on the QT here and there, but I didn't, and it's when you, so essentially it was almost like I sort of started wrestling again, and so it's completely thrown in at the deep end. And then to your point, just surrounded by all these guys I've watched on TV, and not just that, but also like my very first thing I ever did with TNA before even the UK tour, which was where I actually debuted, was on the UK. So the biggest shows they do every year, the biggest attendances. But even before that, I did a PR tour, a media tour with Mick Foley, and I'm just like, who gives a shit what I have to say, like you got Mick Foley, and it was, even then I was sort of acutely aware of the fact that like Dixie's putting me in a position here where I'm going to get heat, because I don't really deserve to be in this position. You know what I mean? I don't like, I've come off Gladiators, and like obviously a lot of people watch that show compared to who watched TNA in the UK, but it was just like, within the wrestling world, it's like, who the hell is this green guy, and why is he doing TV and media appearances with Mick Foley? You know what I mean? And I just remember, I mean, thankfully Mick is such a sweetheart, such a nice guy, that he obviously knew that I sort of had no control over this. So he was trying his best to be very like, just sort of help me out where he could. But I mean, that nervousness and that awareness, I think, just made me so horrible for the first 6 months before. And it was only when I started to sort of settle down, and then they mercifully brought in Doug Williams. They made us a tag team, because I mean, not to mention the fact that I was given a horrible gimmick, like just the worst character, just nothing close to like my real personality at all. So it was just like all these different things come together, and I'm just going like, I was dying on the vine. I mean, I would have been fired within 6 months had they not brought in Doug to make us a tag team.
And what was it like working with Doug? Because he's someone, in my opinion, is one of the best technical wrestlers around. And would you say he's someone that you learn a lot from, actually tagging up with him?
Oh, without question. But even more than that, it was a sort of full circle moment in a roundabout way, because Doug, when I was training at Dropkicks, we all looked up to Doug, because you have to remember, the last British wrestler to have gone to the WWE, was Regal, really. Like Dave Taylor had sort of been, had a little run, but for this huge amount of time, it had been like Davey Boy and Regal.
Yeah.
And like I said, a handful of different guys in and out here and there, but nothing to the level where they felt like we're a star. Regal was the only star who had come from Britain. So we're looking at this, and we're all thinking, there's like one token British guy, that's And you look at our generation, like myself, Drew, Sheamus, Stu, and then Marty, and and like Stu and Sheamus are a few years older than I am, but we're all kind of in that same bracket, and it was like we all pushed through, we all sort of kicked that door open, but we all looked up to Doug so much because Doug was going to Ring of Honor, and Doug was going to Japan, and Doug was a big deal in Japan. Like, and we used to hear these, where it's like, do you know how much money he makes in Japan? Like, he makes like X thousand a week. And we're going like, what? Like, oh my God, that's nuts. Like, oh yeah, he's really well revered in Japan. And, they treat me, and he was one of the top gaijin for Noah at that point. So it was like, when Doug came in, we were all like, that this is a real deal. And I remember he came in one day to drop kicks just to sort of help train the guys, take a class. And again, same thing. I made a point to just try to get in front of him and, be as much as I could. And again, because I had somewhat of a decent look, I'd actually made a point to work out and try to get a good physique. That was enough for him to sort of be like, hey, what's your deal? What's your name? Where are you from? Blah, blah, blah. And I got booked by John Fremantle, who was a promoter down on the South Coast for Premier Promotions, who were another sort of quite well-known promotion at the time. And they did all traditional, they were still doing the traditional British wrestling in rounds and all that. And he called me one day and said, I'd like to book you for this show in Worthing. I was like, hey, great. He's like, yes, Doug Williams recommended you to me. I was like, wow, I remember thinking like, wow, Doug Williams recommended me. And he's like, yes, in fact, Doug said he'd wrestle you. And I'm just kind of like, Doug's going to wrestle you. He said, bring him in, he'll have a work with me, I'll get him over. And he did, drag me through a traditional, 2 out of 3 falls, British rounds match, even let me get a fall. And again, it was like just another cool thing where to then, a few years later, fast forward, and Terry Taylor comes up to me and says, look, I know you hate this Brutus Magnus gimmick. I know you hate this sort of Roman gladiator gimmick and all that stuff. He's like, we're thinking about bringing in Doug Williams and having you guys be a tag team. And I was just like, yes, that would be amazing. I would love that, and because I knew we would complement each other well too, because I knew Doug was not the strongest guy in the world on the promos, on the microphone. So I was like, I started seeing in my head, okay, he can be the sort of, he can really be the guy, the glue that holds it all together in the ring. And as far as the matches and stuff go, and he can hide my weaknesses in the ring, and I can carry the load on the microphone, on the promos and stuff. Because with TV, you have to think about it in those levels. To me, I always looked at it as 50-50.
And I was going to say, the Invasion became one of the big teams of the company. So for you, do you have a standout kind of moment from your time in the Invasion in regards to like your favorite feud or anything that stands out as things you just enjoyed?
Beer Money, 100%. I mean, Beer Money were the hottest act in the company. No matter a company that had Kurt Angle, Sting, Kevin Nash, Booker T, Scott Steiner, all kinds of big, genuine, star names from the industry. And in 2009, when I started, Beer Money they were 100% the most over act. They would get the strongest reaction everywhere we went, and the guys in the locker room all kind of understood that too, and they I remember, I became real good friends with Sean Davari, and he was one of the first guys that really started educating me on the ways of the business. And he said, Beer Money, the hottest act in the company. And so when we got married to them, it was a natural pairing, because obviously we're the typical, we're the British snobby sort of foreign heels, and they're like these all American, even though Bobby's Canadian, but it's like, and it just matched up so well. And it was just, I mean, that was everything to me, because it's a hard thing to explain, but once you're in a situation where that the reaction is going to be there, that's when you really learn, because then you can relax and start playing with stuff, because you know that I'm like, okay, I'm working with beer money. I know that the people are going to be into it. So I know I can take a few more chances. Whereas, no offense to, I don't know, let's say Shark Boy, right? I could put with Shark Boy or something, right? It's like, they're going to cheer a little bit when he first comes out. But then after that, it's kind of like, now what? And you can't try as much stuff because, the people aren't invested. So it's like, it's so important to get paired up with not just people with more experience, but with people who are over, so that you can, because it gives you that freedom to then try some stuff, because you've actually got their attention, and they're not just going like, who the fuck's this guy? Like, that was, because when you're in that position, they're looking for everything wrong with what you're doing. Yeah. But if you're in a position where the act that you're working with is already over, then they're not looking at it like that. So now they're kind of looking at you to play a part. So now they're kind of going, oh, that was actually kind of cool, oh, I hate this guy, whatever. And for me, I guess the standout moment of that was, we wrestled him in Dublin, and we used to do the National Stadium in Dublin, which is like an old boxing, like it must be one of the only remaining sort of venues specifically built for boxing. And I think it had about 2,500 capacity, but it was just a giant box, it's just this, and it's just that the atmosphere in there was always so electric, because it was just specifically designed for boxing, and that sort of, so it had that sort of fighting, very, very much had that sort of snatch sort of a vibe to it. You know what I mean? Like that kind of very, very, very testosterone filled and very, very loud. And I remember we wrestled Beer Money in that building, and they had Flair with them at the time. So Flair was managing them. And man, we didn't even touch for like 5 minutes. I mean, they were so loud and so into what we were doing that I remember I remember the night before we had wrestled him in France. We'd wrestled him in Paris, and then we'd wrestled him in Lyon. And then when we were in Lyon, we came back, and I remember me and Bobby Roode sort of looking at each other and going like, I said, I feel like there's something missing. I said, I feel like they're waiting for Rick to do something, because Rick was basically just sort of coming out with them and just kind of, just sort of being Flair, right? He didn't have a moment. And I remember, because we would do a spot where I would put one of the guys in the figure four, and Rick would sort of get upset, but because they were baby faces, he didn't get involved or anything. He just stood there, right? And I was thinking, and I said to Bobby, I was like, it's that figure four, because I put him in the figure four. They're expecting Rick to get it back, And that's when I really started understanding that I was starting to really understand and learn the sort of the nuances of booking, And so when Rick came back, Rick's just, I mean, he's just such a sweetheart, and he's just like, that was great, guys, blah, blah, blah. And, I let Bobby do most of the talking because he's the senior, but we sort of say, look, Rick, we think that tomorrow night, we think that we need you to do, I think that the people are waiting for you to do something to me. And he's like, no, guys, this isn't about me. This is about you guys. And he's being real gracious. And we're going, no, you don't understand. Like, we want you to do this, Rick. Like, we want you to, they're waiting for it. It will make the finish. It will make the pop on the finish just like that much more. So then when we got to Dublin, which is like the hottest crowd we worked in front of anyway, we do the same match, except this time, right at the very end, I roll out of the ring. I'm like discombobulated. I feed around to Rick, and Rick chops me on the floor, and, and the place just erupts. I mean, just like, it was so loud. It was like ringing in my ears, and then they do the finish 1, 2, 3, and Rick's like strutting around on top of me. And like, and I remember I'm sort of like stumbling to get up, just kind of selling whatever. And Rick came and hit me in the balls, like just off, on the fly, like off the cuff. And I remember he like hit me in the balls, and I went down again. I mean, he didn't hurt me. He did it. He worked it, but he came and stood over me and was like, "Hey, thanks, brother." Like that was great. Like, and that was like, to me, was such a turning point in my career, because I remember thinking, Ric Flair, probably the greatest of all time, just came and told me that I was right. You did like good, and thanks. It was the right call. And I was probably 23 or 24 at that point. I was just like, holy shit, this is the best day of my life.
And that's the thing, to be so young and you're getting to work with all these people. It's just incredible what you had done at such a young age. And obviously, I can only imagine. Obviously, winning the heavyweight title must have been something so special for you, working with the likes of Kurt Angle and all the other names that you mentioned earlier. So when you found out you were going to get the title, did you ever kind of sit back and think, I can't believe I'm getting this opportunity? I'm so young.
Yeah, I mean, I found out on the day, so it wasn't. I didn't have a lot of time to sit around and get in my own head about it. I kind of I had a sense that they might, because if you go back and look at that whole year, 2013, I had really been positioned. I mean, they'd really done a good job. You know, people can say what they want about how TNA handled my run once I got the title, but the way that they primed me and prepared me to be considered a main event guy at TNA was brilliantly done. You know, they really did a good job with that, because I started off in the Bound for Glory series, and I, you know, worked my way through that. And I'm, you know, you could, and they put me in the main event Mafia, which I remember thinking was never going to work, because I was like, Sting, Kurt Angle, Samoa Joe, and me, like, how does this, you know, first of all, it was supposed to be guys who had been world champion before, and, you know, and all this kind of thing. And I'd probably been in one main event, and that was with Sting.
Yeah.
You know, it was just like, did the job to him in like 4 minutes. But it was like, I remember them telling me, like, the reason we're doing it like this is, one, because Sting wants you in it, because Steve, more than anyone, even more than Kevin and stuff, really went above and beyond to try to advocate for me. And they said Sting basically said he would do the Mafia again, but he wanted to do it where there was guys from the past, present, and future. It wasn't all just like established guys.
Yeah.
So he said, you know, Sting said this. I'm not saying this, but Sting was like, I'm the old guy, you know. Kurt's the current, you know, the living legend is still working on top. Joe's the present, and you're the future. And I remember thinking, like, okay.
Wow.
And they told me, like, they called me. It was actually Dave Lagana, who I work with now with the NWA, but he called me and was like, do you own a suit? And I was like, not really. He's like, well, you need to go somewhere and get some nice ones, like custom made, because you're going to be in the main event Mafia this, like, next week on TV. So like 4 days to go and get. I went and dropped like $2,000 on custom made suits and stuff, and get them all made and stuff. And I show up to Las Vegas. It was like 110 degrees too, so hot. So I'm just sweating, like, we're all sweating buckets in these suits, like, you know. Like, and I remember just standing there, the way they teed it up. I remember thinking to myself, if they announce my name and these people don't give a shit, and it's just crickets, it's just silence, like, my career's over, you know, because like TNA will just, you know, because it was too much of a sort of a stage that they'd teed up where I'd never be able to recover from it. And thankfully I got a decent enough reaction. And then I cut a promo, and it was a decent promo. And then I came back, and like Bruce Pritchard was there, and Hogan, and they were like, good promo, kid. Like, you know, you did a good job. And it was like, just all the way through that, from there through to the Bound for Glory series final. That was one of the most important matches of my career, the match with AJ Styles in St. Louis, because I lost. Like, if I'd have won that match, everyone would have farted on it and said, they're pushing this guy too much. And, you know, we've seen how fans can do that with other, you know, with certain guys over the years, where they once they know that you're being shoved down their throat, and you're being sort of anointed as the guy, the fans will go, nope, stop. Like, you know, it's like kids. It's like when you're trying to make them eat something, it's, you know, they're just, you know, their reaction is, no, don't want it. And they did a really smart thing of having me lose to AJ in that, you know, in that final thing, because coming off the back of that, then I earned everyone's respect, because they sort of went, okay, this kid's earned it. He's been here since '09. He's been here 4 years. He's worked every spot on the card. Now we want to see him get to, get pushed through to the, break that glass ceiling sort of thing. And and then Sting, of course, just really kind of emphasized all that by saying, I want to wrestle him at Bound for Glory, and he's winning. Like, Sting was the one who made that happen. They would never have asked Sting to lose to me. They would never have done that. They told me up until the day, like, you'll put Sting over, but it will make you in the process, kind of thing. And I was totally okay with that. And Sting was the one who was like, he came up to me earlier that day. I remember at catering, and he sat down with me and he goes, "The finish is me over on you." And I said, that's what they told me. And he's like, no. He's like, no, this whole thing has been set up. You're going to beat me, and you're going to beat me with your finish in the middle. And I just went like, and I said, Steve, my finish is a submission, it's a cloverleaf. And he's like, yeah, what's wrong with that? And I was like, you're okay to submit? Are you going to tap? And he's like, yeah, that's what I want. And Kurt was sitting with us, and Kurt looked at me and was like, after Steve got up, Steve went, I'm going to go talk to them and I'll come back. And Kurt looked at me and went, he wouldn't even tap out to me. I was just like, so, obviously coming off the back of that, it's like that to me was bigger than winning the world title. Was beating Sting with a submission, because I think it's only me and Bret Hart that have ever done that. And so that was in like October. So by the time I got to December, which is when I won the title, it was the way that it had been set up, I think it was a 4-man tournament, and it was like me and Bobby and Jeff Hardy, and I want to say maybe Austin Aries. I can't remember the fourth guy. But I go over on Bobby, and then Jeff gets through. And I remember thinking like, oh, maybe they'll go with Jeff. Jeff's a huge star. And there were genuinely points that in the year before where some of us would go up to Jeff, like we had heard back in the day, guys would go up to Hogan. There were genuinely times on the house shows in like 2012 where some of us would go up to Jeff and thank him for the house, because it was so obvious that everyone had come just to see him. So like there were times where we would genuinely do that, where like me and Robbie E and a bunch of the guys would go to Jeff and be like, hey Jeff, thanks for thanks for the house, basically, because we have a job because of you, kind of thing. So it was like, if they'd have said, hey, Jeff's winning title, I would have been like, yep, totally understand that. He's the biggest star we've got, But I got there that day, and I remember Scott D'Amore was there. And Scott used to work for TNA. He does again now. We work Impact, And but Scott was my agent, my real agent. He negotiated my contract. And I remember saying like, "What are you doing here?" And he was like, well, "I'm always here when my guys have got a special day." And I was like, "What does that mean?" And he obviously knew before I did. And then they said, "Okay, this is like weird. It was like a cage match, but it was like you had to get out of the cage and then climb a ladder." It was like a cage match and a ladder match, and all that. And they set it up where like I was going to turn heel and win the title and stuff. And I was just like, okay, wow, all right, let's do this. And so I was just focused on the match at that point. I don't really remember much of that day because I got of course, like this first of a series of bad luck with winning the TNA title. I got a concussion, a really bad concussion, about 2 minutes into that match. Like one of the first exchanges of the whole match, I really rung my bell, and it was totally my fault. It wasn't Jeff's fault. I think it's because I was nervous, obviously, from the event, just from thinking like, shit, I'm winning the title and everything. I just got my feet caught under me. Jeff does this move where he goes up and over out of the corner, and he lands his feet on your shoulders, and then comes out with like a Hurricane Rana or head scissors, and I just spiked myself right on my head. And if you watch the match back, it kind of looks like I roll, but if you really look closely, it's like I just go like donk right on my head. And I remember just popping up from that and just immediately like everything went quiet. had like complete tunnel vision, and I remember just thinking like, oh shit, like what's happening? And the rest of that match I was completely on autopilot. Like I remember managing to sort of get hold of Jeff at one point and be like, Jeff, I rung my bell. I don't know what's going on. Like, talk to me.
Yeah.
And he just, bit by bit, you know, it's just like took the whole thing. And I was like that whole, if you watch that match, I mean, Jeff, bless his heart, that's how you know he's fearless, because he did the whisper in the wind off the top of the cage, which is like a horrific bump. And I've always prided myself on being a good guy to catch, you know, I'm good at catching guys when they do those things. And Jeff does one first, a normal one off the top rope, and I completely whiff him. I mean, I'm completely out of position. I'm like, and he just splat, just hits the mat, you know, and I immediately just went, I remember thinking, oh God, I completely missed him on that dive, you know, which is a huge no-no. Right, you know, you should always make sure you take care of your opponent. And then by then I was sort of slowly starting to get my bearings back, and I remember thinking, the next one's off the top of the cage. And I remember in the moment thinking, if I'm Jeff and he's just missed me completely on this one, no way I'm going up and doing one off the top of the cage, you know?
Yeah.
And I go, sorry, Jeff, sorry. He's like, that's all right, man. He's like, you ready for the big one? I just went, yeah. And he went up, and I was like, I'll be there for this one. And I mean, if you look, like, I'm like this, and I make sure I get completely underneath him, and he just legit just like completely knocks me over. Like I take all the sting out of it for him. But all of that I'm just doing completely on autopilot, you know, and I get through all that, and you know, so it was a weird night because I knew I had a concussion. And then, so it was like, I won the title and I knew that it was a big deal, but at the same time I was really freaked out because I'd never had a concussion like that before or since, knock on wood. So I came back, and fortunately, I guess a lot of people didn't even notice, but Scott noticed, because I remember Scott, but you know, everyone's there to congratulate me, like new champ, blah, blah, blah. And it was a big deal for a lot of the guys in TNA because they saw me as like, they had really picked me up from scratch. You know, I was like one of the first guys that they had really nurtured from day one all the way to being world champion, you know. So there was a lot like Bob Ryder and guys like that who I had a really good relationship with. They were really, you know, really pleased for me. But I remember Scott D'Amore like busting through that crowd of people and being like, everyone get away, everyone step back, sit down, you know what I mean? Like because he knew, and he was just like, you hurt yourself, you know. I was just like, I don't know what's going on, you know. I couldn't recall conversations, so like I would have a conversation with him, and then 2 minutes later I'd just say the exact same thing, you know, over and over again, just, you know, but yeah, I think it went pretty well, you know, like I really rung my bell, and you know, I don't know if you noticed, but I hurt myself. Yeah, we noticed, you know. But it's like so the only things I really remember from that day after that were getting back to the hotel, and Spud, who people will know better now as Drake Maverick in WWE, he came with me to my room, and he stayed up all night keeping an eye on me because he was like, you gotta be really careful when you have a concussion like that. You shouldn't really go to sleep, or if you do, you shouldn't sleep for very long. You should sleep for a little while and get up again, because that's when you're at the most risk of getting brain hemorrhage and stuff. So Jay stayed with me the whole night and was just like, I'll stay here, you know, keep the lights on low. And I just kept like, I was going through all the range of things. I mean, obviously I've got to know Chris Nowinski now and learned much more about concussions and stuff, like we all have, you know, in the last sort of decade or so. But I ran the gambit of all the typical sort of concussion symptoms. I mean, I would get agitated, and then I would start crying, and then I would, you know what I mean? I would just go through all this stuff. So, you know, unfortunately, it just sort of set the tone then for my run, because they had to sort of, because I was in no condition to wrestle the next days, and they were taping. So then we did the screwy stuff with AJ and all the interferences and stuff like that, and all the fans online just completely shit on it. So it just I can understand it from their point of view. Like it just sort of it took all the wind out of the sails. So it was a kind of lackluster run as champion, but I would never take anything away from the fact that it was obviously a big moment, and to be the first Brit to have a significant world title on television and stuff like that. My favorite thing about that whole experience was when I came back to England for Christmas, because it was the last TV tapings before Christmas. So it was so fun to be able to come home with the championship and, go to my parents' house and like show my, all my nieces and nephews, like, and then as the show actually aired and I could actually talk about it, it was like they ended up having a fan party in London at I forget the name of the venue, but it's like a fun little gig venue in London, and JB just set it up like impromptu, like just a celebration sort of thing, a fan party. And I remember it was sold out, it was like packed, and I remember just thinking that's really cool, just walking, like that was the first time I really felt like the world champion, because it was like all the media attention and stuff like that. I didn't think anyone would really give a shit that much, but they really did. And they were just like, broken the glass ceiling for British wrestlers. And so many wrestlers reached out to, just to sort of say like, you did it, like you've opened you've broken the glass ceiling for British wrestlers. You've made it can be done, and I hope it did do that a little bit, because obviously now look where we are. Drew's the WWE champion and he deserves to be there, man. And like he was one of them. He was one of the guys who reached out to me at that point and was like, congrats, man. It's like so cool. Like, Stu was another one. They're in WWE, right? They're in the promised land, but they're reaching out to me going like, you did it. Like you've broken the glass ceiling for us. Like what you want, you're the world champion.
I was very good. Quickly got to connect the charger here because it's about to die.
No worries.
I'm back all charged. One thing I did want to very quickly touch upon was you were talking very much about Sting. Now, from an observation, so I'm a huge fan of Sting, and I've watched loads of documentaries about him as a person, and I would say there's a lot of similarities, and that maybe is why he wanted to give you that opportunity, in a sense where he's someone that really studied the business, and he would. Oh well, I don't know Sting, but I'd imagine he would be like you if he wanted to say, "Hang on a minute, I think I'm worth this." They would be someone that would speak up and say if they think they're worth something. So I'd say there's a lot of similarities, which is probably why he did take you under, his wing as such.
Yeah, I think based on the conversations I've had with Steve over the years, I think what he saw in me was that someone who represented the same values that he had as far as like principles for the business. I mean, our backgrounds and ways into the business are completely different. Like he was a bodybuilder in California. He was a bodybuilder in Venice Beach. So literally the sort of the stereotype, California muscle guy. And he was literally found, he literally, there was an ad placed for like wannabe wrestlers. And he was like, he went to see a WWE. He'd never seen wrestling. I mean, he was in his 20s before he even saw it, and then he saw Hogan and all those guys come to. I think they came to the Coliseum in LA or something like that, and he remember seeing it, thinking, "Man, like." But I think the thing with Steve is that he primarily got into the business because he thought it was a way to make money, like, and that's a funny thing because that's often looked down at, by people in the business, like, oh, he's just got this to make money. But you need guys like that because they help, reevaluate people's perspective on the business. Going back to the things we were talking about earlier, as far as like knowing what you should be paid and not just accepting stuff just because you really want to be a wrestler, because you're a fan. It's like, there is this constant balancing act you have to do between being a fan and being, you know, and there's a lot of things where like wrestlers will be like, well, I'm not a mark, you know, I'm a, you know, and it's like you, and sometimes that can be taken too far, but ultimately you do have to have a little bit of a control of that, because you have to be able to step back. And I think that's one of the reasons why I was able to have quite a lot of success quite quickly, because I wasn't bogged down with all these sort of traditional mentalities of like, this is what you're supposed to do. And because if you look throughout history, a lot of the guys that really had the biggest success were the ones who didn't have any of that stuff weighing them down mentally, where they could just come in with sort of fresh eyes, you know, because wrestling is really bad sometimes for not seeing the forest for the trees, you know what I mean? Because guys are so deeply indoctrinated into all the sort of subculture elements of it that they're not looking at it from an outside perspective. And then you get a guy like Ultimate Warrior or Sting or Goldberg, you know, who just sort of come in and just like, they get over, you know, everyone goes like, oh, you like that guy? That guy's cool, you know, because they're not doing all the things that a traditional wrestler would do. So like, you do have to, you know, even now I try to remember that sometimes, because obviously now a 16-year veteran, I'm like, I couldn't be more sort of indoctrinated in the ways of the wrestling business. But there are times where I do try to maintain an outside perspective, and I do that by trying to gauge the perspective from people who I know aren't like super dedicated fans, like my brother and stuff, who used to watch it with me, but is like, he doesn't watch it now. But he might watch something and be like, oh, that was funny, or I like that because, you know, and it's important to do that. But I think that's what Sting had, is he had that ability to look at it as like, business first, you know, fun second, and any decisions I make primarily based on what's going to be best for me to make money. And I remember him sitting down with me once and saying, I think that one day, he's like, you're a really good heel, and, you know, you're a really good talker, but he's like, you've got a great body, you're good looking, you got charisma. And he said, one day you need to become a good guy, and you just stay a good guy for the rest of your career. Because in his mind, that's what he did, because that's what made more money. So he was just like, once I got over as a good guy, that was it. I wanted to be a good guy only. Because, you know, but it was just, you know, obviously the business model has changed, and things are a lot different now as far as the way guys are paid and stuff like that. So and, you know, truthfully, everyone has to find their own path. But I know I'm naturally better suited to being a heel. Plus, it sounds silly, I'm not American. So
yeah,
it's always, you know, American audiences, if they've never seen you before, their gut reaction is always going to be to dislike a foreign guy before they like him. So you have to sort of keep that in mind. And it's not a hard and fast rule or anything like that, but it's, you know, and honestly, for me, I see myself sometimes as a sort of last of the Mohicans, you know, as far as like the guys who think of it in those terms, rather than like, oh, I hope I get a good review for my match, you know, and this kind of thing, like, or I hope that everyone, you know, likes it on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, or whatever. It's like, you know, I try to look at it as what's the right thing to do for everybody involved, you know?
Yeah. So I've got to say, normally in these interviews, it's with, you know, I'd interview someone and we speak about their career, and, you know, they've not done anything for many years. But with you, I mean, we've been speaking for over an hour, and there's been so much that you've done, but you're nowhere near even at the, you know, nowhere near the end. You're still in your early 30s. You've got so much to give, and you're on this amazing journey now. Whereas, I mean, I'm a big wrestling fan, but for me, NWA has never been on my radar. I've never seen it. You know, I've never watched it. And then you've come along, and you're the heavyweight champion, and you've given it something, and you've given it a bit more of an identity, and it's becoming talked about. So when you joined and you signed up, did you kind of have this ambition to give this brand something different, because you've done incredible. Whatever you've done has really worked, because it's everywhere now. It's been spoke about in such a good way. So it's like you've given it some new lease of life.
Yeah, well, that's kind of you to say. I think when I first sort of got approached about it, honestly, my career was probably at the lowest point it had been, in over a decade. So I was just kind of like, okay, we'll give it a shot. It's like, what's the worst that can happen? It's like, it's better than nothing, because that was the other option I had at that point in time, and that's not, and that's just the truth. Nowhere, couldn't get through the door anywhere at that point. I was just kind of like damaged goods. And when I saw the headline about Billy buying the company, I remember thinking, it's kind of weird. I wonder why he's doing that. What is the NWA anymore? Is it even a thing? And then once I realized that he had taken Dave with him, Dave Lagana, and then they reached out to me, and they sort of slowly started kind of describing what it was they were trying to achieve. I basically countered back and said, well, this is what I think is missing from wrestling. And I basically said, I want it to feel more, I want there to be more emphasis on building to one match, rather than just like super cards, dream matches, and like amazing match after amazing match. And, because I was just like, I feel like that's all I'm watching is just these really good matches, but not with no emotion. So I was like, why can't we spend more time really focusing on just sort of building up to this one climax, this one amazing moment, this one must-see event kind of thing? And somewhere between the two, our sort of approaches sort of married well. And I just remember Billy calling me and basically saying, look, I'm all for every type of wrestling, but I'm just sick and tired of seeing guys that look like my next door neighbor do gymnastics. And I was just like, okay, you and I can have a conversation, because he was like, I want to see guys who look like men, and I want to see them shit talk each other, and then I want to see them have a fight, and that was that.
And it's working out so well, because like I said to you, it is everywhere. So yeah, you must be loving the journey that you're on, because like you said, it did go quiet for a while for you. And you, in your career, I've noticed you've either, and I know you've touched on it before, you've either been called overrated or underrated.
Yes.
It's always,
I actually talked about that. I forget what interview I did, but I literally said that. I said I've been overrated and underrated my entire career.
And that must be frustrating for you, because it's kind of like, and it's especially wrestling nowadays, people have such an opinion on it. It's almost like they understand it inside out. So, everyone's an expert, essentially. Yeah. So that must be hard for you to deal with. 1 minute, oh, well, he's so underrated, he needs this bigger opportunity, and then at points, oh God, he's so over. That must be hard to deal with.
Here's the thing with that. The whole overrated or underrated thing it's just part of the culture of our generation of millennials when it comes to them not having the courage to own their own opinion. It's never, I like him or don't like him. I'm a fan of his, not a fan of his. They have to generalize their opinion to make it feel like that's what everybody thinks, and it's like, there's no such thing as overrated or underrated. First of all, what even is a rating? You know what I mean? Like, there's no such thing. It's a fabricated business. It's fictional. But, it is are the Fast and Furious movies overrated? I not based on what, because a lot of people obviously don't think so, because they do monster money at the box office.
Yeah.
But are they going to get amazing reviews from the Roger Eberts of the world? No. So it's like, it serves a purpose, and I used to get so much more upset with that kind of stuff, but I just come to realize what it represents. It's just that it's a weakness of the mind that the fans, that those particular fans have, when they say like, and look, when they say underrated, obviously it's a compliment.
Yeah.
Because what they're basically saying is like, I wish more people thought what I do about this guy, or I wish this guy was on a bigger platform and stuff. But it's just become one of those easier terms to use. But like overrated is just one of those things of like, well, I don't really like him, and I wished more people agreed with me, so I'm just going to pretend that they do. You know, and it's just kind of, it's like, but listen, first of all, I married Mickey James, okay, and then I've been like considered, you know, Dixie Carter's like golden boy, Jeff Jarrett's golden boy. Now, you know, Billy Corgan in the NWA. You know, there's nothing that can be said online to me that I haven't read or seen or heard before. And look, I got rattled by that shit when I was in my early 20s, and I'd be wrestling in like Philadelphia or something, and they'd be you know, and I remember I wrestled Chris Daniels once in Philadelphia. I think it was Philadelphia. And obviously Chris Daniels is like very, you know, at that point in time was very in with that type of crowd. And, you know, and so the whole time they're just going overrated. And I was thinking, like, at the time it really rattled me. And Chris was like, don't listen to him, don't worry about it. You know what I mean? But it's like, if the whole place is chanting, like, how am I overrated? You know, because it's like,
yeah,
none of you. It's like, but now, I've got a thicker skin. I've made peace with it, and you know, it's hey, look, you can never please everyone, right? It's just, but I do laugh that's one of, you know, obviously at this point in my life or in my career, even though I'm only 33, I'm sort of an elder statesman at the NWA. And obviously it's nice to be held in that level of esteem. You know, it's nice to show up to the GPB studios in Atlanta and have every single person on the roster basically kind of showing me that deference and respect. And, you know, guys who have been in the business a lot longer than me coming up to me and being like, listen, I want to thank you because all of this is here because of you. You know, like this is such a cool show and I love it so much. And like, that's the real different thing about the NWA than anywhere else I've ever worked, is that like everyone on the show really loves the show. No one's watching it going like, well, some of that kind of was kind of shit, but whatever. Everyone just goes like, God, I dig this show so much. I love it. And the guys who have been around long enough to understand, they kind of know, like, and they, you know, guys like Eddie Kingston and Trevor Murdoch and these, you know, guys who aren't, you know, who really know what they're doing and are salty and been around, just, you know, just say like, listen, man, like you're the reason we're all here. We appreciate it. That's a really cool feeling. But I tell the guys like Ricky Starks, who's someone who I really have gone to bat for as far as to try to help, and, you know, some of the other younger talent, I can, you know, you'll see that they're going to start experiencing some of those things that I did, in the sense of like, now that, you know, when no one's heard of you, it's actually, you know, all you want to do is be known. But once you're known is when the critics, you know, start paying attention. So it's like, I see that in like Camille's one of them. And obviously Camille's, you know, she's dating Tom, who's one of my best friends. And, you know, we basically grew up in the business together. So she's got him to sort of, to give advice to and stuff. But she started in the business as my valet, but it was my bodyguard. So it's like, I've always tried to take an interest in helping her. And there's some other guys. And I always just say to him, I always use that exact example when I say, hey, look, I've been underrated and overrated my entire career. It doesn't mean anything, right? It just, ultimately, you just keep throwing shit at the wall until something sticks. And then once you know that you've got the trust of the audience, as far as like, okay, when he's attached to something, I know it's going to be decent. I know there's going to be a certain level of quality. And I know that I'm going to care about, like, now I get told all the time, oh, you carry yourself like a champion. You carry yourself so well. You're such a great representative of the company. It's like, yeah, you know, I've learned that over time, but a lot of that is because I'm battle tested. You know what I mean? I've got the scars from having my feelings hurt and knowing how to sort of come out the other side of it and how to do it. And I think that overall, the audience over time, the audience kind of can subconsciously understand when they're looking at someone who's like mentally strong.
Yeah. And I mean, for me, just speaking to you, I'm conscious of the time because I know you've given quite a lot today, so I don't want to keep you too long. But in general, it's been good to actually talk about the the British side of wrestling as well, and hearing how you grew up with it and the early beginnings for you as well. So that's been really interesting to hear. And obviously talking about your days in TNA, and I've got to say you do come across very well, and the way you conduct yourself, and it's just been amazing for you to give me the opportunity to actually talk to you today.
I appreciate it. I think, yeah, and I checked out some of your stuff, and it looks like you're hustling hard to sort of to build your brand and all that, and that's I appreciate that, and I always do what I can to help guys like that. So yeah, you're welcome, no problem.
Thank you so much, and keep safe. And
Yeah,
I hope you get too bored in lockdown.
Absolutely. All right. Stay busy.
Thank you.